Coming out tonight. We appreciate everyone coming out. It certainly helps when that's the food being served. It does lead you to want to be here. I do want to also show my age by pulling out my reading glasses. Toledo School for the Arts is really good at making sure that you can hear. Thank you.
Y'all can hear, right?
This is, by the way, in case anyone's interested in, if you love what you see today, Dave is in charge of development for Toledo School of the Arts. So, yeah, he wants to know why my bio was longer than the author. I do want to say there is an organization, or there is a site called Porchlight Books, which rates all of the business books each year that are released, and it just came out, I believe this week, that this book that we're going to talk about tonight was rated as one of the top 40 business books of 2022. So congratulations. So we'll get right into it, and just out of curiosity, how many people have already read the book? Anyone here? All right, so we have 3 of us that have read it. All right, so some of these, don't yell out the answers, because I'm going to ask some questions.
So before Matt starts, how many of you have been to Zingerman's or order from mail order? Okay, yay, all right, good.
All right, this was another line of questioning that I was going to take us on. How many of you are familiar with Zingerman's Roadhouse? Raise your hand. Yeah. Okay. How many, she asked about mail order. How many of you are familiar with the Creamery?
Good.
Bakehouse.
Oh, wow, okay.
Corman Farms. There's some, all right.
There's some
So why don't we start out and why don't you kind of go through where the name Zingerman's came from and who was Mr. Zingerman?
So before I do that, I just want to tell you all how happy I am to be back in Toledo. As a young girl born in Ann Arbor, with parents and a godmother who liked to educate us, we came to Toledo many times to go to the art museum, to go to the zoo. My mother had a great friend, Mrs. Diebold, and they loved to shop. So we would also come to Jacobson's. And I worked at Jacobson's in high school and college and just after college. And the Toledo Jacobson's had a reputation as one of the top Jacobson's in the Jacobson's group. So I just wanted to say that I always have felt very much at home here in Toledo, and I'm thrilled to be back. So thanks for having me. So, Mr. Zingerman. Does anyone think there was a Mr. Zingerman? Okay, good, because there wasn't. So, and it's always a subject of amusement when people will come into the deli or the roadhouse and saying the original Mr. Zingerman was a friend of the family and probably expect a discount. But there was no Mr. Zingerman. Zingerman's was originally going to be called Greenberg's because Ari and Paul, who were the co-founders, wanted a Jewish-sounding name. And a week before the deli opened, they found out that indeed there was a Mr. Greenberg in Lansing, Michigan. And Mr. Greenberg was not happy to lend them his name and basically said, don't do it or I'll sue you. And they had to come up with a new name. And so one of the things they did was think about the alphabet. And they thought, well, we could pick an A name, but nobody picks a Z name. You know, if we pick a Z, we can stand out more than we would if we were at the beginning of the alphabet. And so that is how Zingerman's, the name, came about.
And then we started polling who's heard of what. Why don't you, Mickey, go into a little bit about the Zingerman collection of businesses?
Yeah, so the reason there's a collection of businesses is that, and we'll skip around a little bit, but Zingerman's was open for about 10 years. They launched in 1982, and in 1992 they started to notice that they were being copied. And there's a deli in Ann Arbor that's still there called Amir's, and I write about this in the book. And Zingerman's thought that Amir's was stealing their look, their typeface, their names for their sandwiches. And of course, Amir said, of course we're not doing that. You can't patent a black and white floor. You can't patent a name of a sandwich. But the problem was that people thought they were related to Zingerman's and they weren't happy with the quality, and they would call Zingerman's and complain. And so that led to a lawsuit that hung around for about 15 years, and the settlement was private, but essentially they decided if somebody's gonna copy us, we need to keep growing, so there's so many moving parts that no one can do all of it at once. And at the same time, they wanted to make sure that there were business opportunities for the people who had joined them and grew up in the company. And as the company expanded, they thought, we're going to make opportunities available for these folks to be managing partners and be part of the business.
So today, and I know we're jumping around already,
Yeah.
but that's kind of my style, is that I'm like a dog chasing a squirrel. So how many different businesses make that up today?
So there's 11 different companies, but there's 33 different trademark names, I guess you could call it. So they essentially they're divided into two pieces. It's a little complicated as a business unit, but they weren't founded as a company in which people could invest. They were founded as an LLC, a limited liability corporation, which just means that the people that own it have the liability for it. And then there was another way that some of the companies were founded. So it can't really be meshed together, but Ari and Paul make their money because these businesses pay a licensing fee to use the Zingerman's name. They don't take a share of the profits. You know, there's not a nickel per cookie or anything like that. They just accept this licensing fee, and that's how the community of businesses was able to grow.
So, in your opinion, why do you think that, let's go back to Zingerman's the Deli now.
Yeah.
Why do you think that worked in Ann Arbor specifically?
Well, so Ann Arbor, as you all may know, has a very vibrant Jewish community. I am not a member of the tribe. I'm an honorary member of the tribe, and we had very dear Jewish neighbors, the Pears, who owned a clothing store. And she bought Girl Scout cookies for me, and my mother would buy her bagel boxes from her dasa. And you know, I was very curious. I read the All of a Kind family books when I was growing up, and I wanted to know about Jewish customs and food and holidays and all that. And my parents were very, very liberal Catholics, and they figured, why not? You know, it's not gonna hurt her. So we had our Jewish community in Ann Arbor, and we had great interest in Jewish culture, Jewish art, Jewish politicians. Raoul Wallenberg went to U of M, which is just, every time I walk around the campus, I think, Raoul Wallenberg walked on this campus. Arthur Miller went here, Mike Wallace went here, you know, James Earl Jones went here. And so it was predisposed to welcome something like Zingerman's. At the time I was growing up, if you wanted deli food, you had to go to Detroit. So we would go to Hudson's, if people remember J.L. Hudson's, and behind Hudson's there was the Broadway Deli, and we would go and get bagels and smoked salmon, lox, and some cream cheese and bring it back to Ann Arbor. And then when Ari and Paul got there, Ari was from Chicago, and he knew about the delis in Chicago. Paul was from Detroit. Detroit has a great deli tradition. And the two of them, once they met, thought, you know, we could have a deli here in Ann Arbor. And they started kicking around the plans to build a deli, and they were sure that Ann Arbor, with the university, with all the alumni, with the people that live there that travel, that they would be predisposed to supporting the kind of deli that they wanted to create.
So, I think they might be onto something.
Yeah,
It
it's
might work.
possible.
It might
Yeah.
work. Why do you think that, I mean, it seems such a simple concept. Why do you think that it has this unique flavor there and it hasn't worked in other cities the same
Well,
way?
that's interesting. So, first of all, you need a Jewish community. and you need both the Jewish community in Ann Arbor and the Jewish community in Metro Detroit, and folks from here. You need people who leave Ann Arbor but have warm memories of Zingerman's. So the mail order company has 2 million names on their list, and about 100,000 individual people order something every year. So all those U of M alumni have been a wonderful market for Zingerman's. I think it's another reason is that we are living in a much more sophisticated food time than we were 20, 30, 40 years ago. And as I write in the book, you know, when Zingerman started, Alice Waters had started her restaurant in California. Dina DeLuca, which is now gone, had started. There was Balducci's in New York, which is now gone. Zabar's, of course, has very happily survived. I'm a huge Zabar's fan. And prospered, and there were still the famous delis in New York, the Stage, the Carnegie, and there were delis in Chicago, Manny's, for example, and I think they thought that, you know, we've got the money, we've got the intellect, we've got the adventures in food. I think this is a good place to plant the seed.
So you mentioned mail order. That number, just to repeat, was 2 million. Oh, by the way, when this did jump out at me, when she was mentioning famous U of M alumni, she did not mention Hallie Freed. Right?
And Hallie Freed.
Right. And Warren Sachs, right. And Ted Kaczynski.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, sorry about that. Yeah.
And I didn't mention any of those athletes.
Right.
Either, so.
But you mentioned the mail order, 2 million,
2 million names.
2 million names on the mail order. How many people in here get that mail order in the mail? So a lot of us get it.
Yeah.
Tell us the artwork in that is so unique and it's so distinctive. Tell us a little bit about the background of that and how it survived all this time.
So I'm a super visual person. You know, I love coming to the Toledo Museum of Art. They did an exhibit a few years ago, pop art. I don't know if people remember that. Yeah, Warhol, Jim Dine. Here's our art expert. Judy and I were standing there talking about exhibits at the Toledo Museum of Art. I don't know if people remember El Greco in Toledo. Yeah. So one of the first people hired at Zingerman's was a guy named Steve Walagmunia. And Steve came in, and they literally just opened, and he was asking a few questions, and they said, well, we can hire you. And they gave him a little notebook, and he said, I didn't know you could get oil out of olives. He'd never heard of anything like that. But he was a cartoonist in his spare time, and he liked R. Crumb, the rock and roll cartoonist. He liked that stylized kind of hippie look, and he started fooling around with how could I illustrate cheese. You know, he drew a goat, and the goat looked a little bit like Gumby, from the cartoon. And he just decided, you know what, I'm going to start drawing these things. And Paul and Ari are like, great. You know, if you want to go to the trouble, we'll let you illustrate anything you want. And then people started to really respond to it. And they would make little flyers. And I actually have an archive of individual sheets that they would write up, like balsamic vinegar. You know, let's go to Italy, and here's how vinegar is made. And it would be a whole little treatise on making vinegar. And so he essentially is one of the reasons why Zingerman's looks the way it does. That Z that you guys, I call it the Zorro Z, but he and Paul Saganaw's wife sat down to come up with a logo, and Lori drew it, and he thought it was a little too feminine, and so he toughened up the Z. And that logo from 1982 is the same logo they have now. And I asked Ari about it, like, do you think you need a refresh? And he said, why would we fix something that isn't broken? So now Ian Nagy is the head of the art studio, and there's 3 graphic artists full-time. And all they do is illustrate all the Zingerman's literature. They work on the mail order catalog. They draw everything that you see in all of the businesses, the labels for the coffee, that kind of thing. And they consider that to be a very important part of their message. And you think about companies that spend millions of dollars rebranding. And they've never had to do that because they were lucky and or smart enough so that their original approach works 40 years later.
I'm shocked that there's only, with the volume that comes out, that there's
Yeah.
only 3 people in that.
So the mail order catalog is a real load for them. I just got the Christmas catalog, and they're literally tweaking it right until it goes to the printers.
Did you sit with them and watch that process at all?
They zinged me. There's actually a caricature of me. And the funny thing is, anything that's sold by Zingerman's has to be illustrated by Zingerman's. So if you hold up my book cover.
Yeah.
So Joel Holland, who's a very talented illustrator in New York, drew that book cover. Zingerman's redrew the book cover to go up on their website. Not much of a difference, but it looks a little more like Zingerman's than Joel's picture.
Is this already listed on their website?
Yeah, they've been very supportive, and it's been for sale on the Zingerman's Press website. You can buy it on the deli, you can buy it in the Roadhouse. I think it's in the Bakehouse. So yeah, they've been super nice about it.
So let's go a little bit into that because they're famously kind of protective of their story and their businesses. How did you get them to agree to let you write this book?
So I've known Ari a long time. I've known Paul about as long. And I wrote an article in 2007 when Zingerman celebrated their 25th anniversary. And it was the New York Times was starting a small business section. And they asked me for an idea of a company we could focus on. And I suggested Zingerman's. And the article became the most emailed article for weeks. People in New York love Zingerman's. People who read the Times digitally love Zingerman's. And it kind of told me that there was real national interest. But, the years go on and you have other things to do, like I was covering all the auto bankruptcies and went to work for NPR and things like that. And I got an email over Thanksgiving of 2019 from a lady named Irene Goodman, who is from suburban Detroit, two degrees from the University of Michigan, literary agent in New York. And she said, I am a fan of Zingerman's. I think there should be a book about Zingerman's, and I think you're the person to write it. Well, in the literary world, that never happens. It's like getting that email from the Nigerian prince that offers you $20 million. It's like, because I had a literary agent, and so it isn't really kosher to work with another agent. I needed my agent's permission, and she said, fine, I was working on a novel at the time, actually, and she said, well, that's not a book I would try to sell for you, so go ahead if you want to do this. And so I wrote a book proposal, and I had talked to Ari at the very beginning, and I said, would you guys work with me? And he said, I don't see why not. And then things got more serious, and publishers were considering the book, and then Scribner's asked to have a meeting with me, Ari, and Irene. And we scheduled the meeting for March 16th, 2020. Now, that date might sound familiar because that was the date that all the states across the Great Lakes shut down. And Ari came to the meeting and he said, this is the worst day of my life. I've just had to lay off 300 people. Yeah. And I was afraid that the deal wouldn't happen because publishers were canceling deals right and left. But Scribner's hung in there and made an offer, and we made the deal to do the book. And the interesting thing was that this has happened with my other books, is that there's always some people that will cooperate with you right away because you have built up the relationships. And then there's always people that won't talk to you, and they ghost you on your emails. They just don't respond. And I was sweating bullets as my deadline got closer because mail order hadn't responded, and the CFO hadn't responded. And 3 weeks before my deadline, finally one of the mail order partners agreed to talk to me. And then I got the CFO on the phone, and then I felt like, I got those last details that I wanted for the book. But it was literally a year of doing interviews and kind of meeting one person, and the one person would say, well, she asks good questions, you should talk to her, that sort of thing. It's like fishing, you might hook the fish right away, but it's gonna take you a while to reel it in.
So, having done the research on this, what do you think are the, let's skip culture and let's talk about the business itself. We'll come back to culture. What do you think are the four or two or three or four things that have set this group of businesses apart that really makes them unique and really makes them successful?
So absolutely, customer service would be at the top of my list. And one of the things when you go to Zingerman's, whether it's the deli, the roadhouse, the bakehouse, creamery, whatever, when you're being waited on, you're the only person in the world. They are not rushing you along. They are not saying you can only have one sample of something. The sampling thing got a little iffy during the pandemic, but they're back to letting people sample things. They may get stressed out in the back room, but they really don't show it when they're working directly with customers. They try not to show it. I think another trait of Zingerman's is the constant kind of refreshing. They have the tried and true things on the menu, you know, the Reuben, corned beef sandwiches, latkes. The Roadhouse is known for its fried chicken. But I ate at the Roadhouse yesterday and I had this salad that was harissa, whipped feta with roasted carrots, farro, and kale. And it's one of the best salads I've had in a long time. And I thought, you know, this has been on the menu for like 2 days and I'm already like feeling like it's one of the best things I've ever eaten there. And they're constantly accepting suggestions from customers, seeing how they can update the menus, seeing what isn't selling, taking it off if they have to. And especially the last couple of years, they've had to do a lot of experimentation with the menu to just see what they could afford to offer. And then I think the last thing is that they really make an effort to keep you and the family, you know, so if you think about the mail order catalog, I mean, you might order once, send a Shiva gift or something, and then you get the catalog. And then maybe the recipient gets the catalog. And it's not the kind of catalog that's like an annoyance. A lot of people really enjoy sitting down and reading those catalogs. So they're, you know, it's literally an effort to create community.
So speaking of customer service, this was not in the book, but in our conversation, you told me about one time you were at the Roadhouse and there was like a funeral.
Oh, yeah. So this happened about 2 months ago. When I go to the Roadhouse, I like to sit at that counter in the front. I love to watch the kitchen. I love to watch the expediters moving the dishes along and all that. And so I got there and I noticed that there's like this buzz. And what had happened was they normally, if you walk in, they limit the number of walk-ins to 24 in a party. So because they just, you know, they have to have a server, they have to have a busser, the kitchen, etc. A funeral lunch had shown up with 65 people. No advance notice. And I don't know why the folks thought they could just show up at Zingerman's with 65 people, but they must love Zingerman's and thought they would take care of them. So a lot of this took place before I got there, but they gave them a separate room. They gave them a choice of entrees. There was like a burger, a salad with chicken, a salad with grilled salmon, and then dessert. And I'm watching as they're putting these orders in the kitchen, and the kitchen's firing the chicken and getting the burgers ready, and out they're coming through the window, and they're being run to the side room so everybody could get served. And a gentleman came out and said, "I need more Diet Coke." And you know, nobody said, "We've got 65 orders to get out." They just said, "Well, sure, we'll get you your Diet Coke right away." And then once they got all the orders out of the kitchen, everybody applauded each other. And they didn't do it because I was sitting there. They did it because they were all glad that they were able to accomplish this funeral lunch. But they would really appreciate it if you call ahead.
So that leads a little bit into the culture piece. And you did talk about how how they do take customer suggestions at the Roadhouse, and now let's talk a little bit about some of the things that make it unique culture and employee suggestions and things that really set Zings apart.
Yeah, so one of the things I find so interesting about Zingerman's is that from the very beginning, Ari and Paul were doing more than just starting a deli. They were starting a business with values. And we hear about mission statements and value statements and all that all the time. But you can put something on a piece of paper, and if employees don't believe it, they're not going to follow it. They don't care. And I think one of the things that stands out for me is that the two of them, Paul, I think, or Ari had an apartment with a roof deck, and as they were getting going, they would go up on the roof and they would read business books and circle things and pass them back and forth, and they would find concepts in articles, and they would call up the person who was the inventor of a concept and ask if they could interview them about it. And so there are a number of concepts that I write about in the book. One is called servant leadership, which is the idea that there's no one in the organization that's above helping the other people in the organization. I don't know if people have been to the Roadhouse and have seen Ari pour in water. Okay, so he does that deliberately. Because first of all, there are people who don't know who he is. They just think he's this tall guy in a t-shirt and jeans and he's refilling their water glass. If they do know who he is, then that's their opportunity to say, hey, Ari, nice to see you. Or, this is my granddaughter, she goes to Michigan, and Ari will give you his business card. He's pulling you into the community. And then he can see if you ordered the special, are you eating the special? If you ordered the fried chicken, is it disappearing or is it just kind of sitting there? Are you deep in conversation, he won't bother you, or is this not a first date that's not going very well? You might need a little humor. And so that's servant leadership, and I know it now when I see it, and I also know it when I don't see it. And I will not name the dean that did this to me, but when I was at one of the universities, I come in as director of my department, and my staff was super fired up, and we got Ari on the phone, and Ari guided us through writing a vision for our department. And I had gone to my associate dean and said, hey, we're working on this. And she said, that's great. She said, when you're done with it, I'll show it to the dean. And so she showed it to the dean, and the dean said, no. He said, this isn't my idea, and you can't implement it. But that was how he led the department. He wanted it driven from the dean's office down, not from us up to him. Frankly, I think we could save him grief. I mean, we can just be empowered to run our department, and it's now been almost 10 years, and I still remember how deflated I felt from being told I'm not going to sign off on this because it wasn't my idea. But one thing I learned was that was the kind of person that you had to make it seem like it was their idea. So.
Right, and I read Mickey's bio and talked to her a little bit. She doesn't want to say the school. She is wearing red. It was Ohio State.
No, No, I'm not welcome in Columbus.
All right.
I was told that by someone at Trader Joe's. She said, you're lucky that I'm checking you out. So, I'm not kidding. So, anyway.
Why?
Because I was from Ann Arbor, because I had to show ID.
Oh, that's a silly question.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the concepts that you wrote about in the book that I think is really unique to Zingerman's, and it's super interesting, is everyone's familiar with the concept of goal setting. Zingerman's, and I think especially it's Ari who leads this, they have a concept called visioning. Why don't you talk a little bit about that, and then maybe tie it into your life a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So in the book, you'll find a couple of examples straight from Zingerman's of the idea of visioning. And the idea of visioning is that you paint a picture of where you would like to be at a certain point in the future. Usually it's 5 years, sometimes it's 2 years. One of the problems with the pandemic was it was kind of impossible to say in 2 years we want X because we didn't know what was happening with COVID. But essentially you say in, let's see, 2032, we would like Zingerman's to have 14 businesses. We would like to have 1,000 employees. We would like to be known as the premier maker of biscuits in the Midwest. I'm just throwing these out there. It isn't a how-to, it isn't steps on how you're going to get there, but it's painting this picture so that you have an idea of where you're going. And one of the things that visioning does is it puts all the other stuff to the side. So if you've decided that you would like this picture to exist in 2032, and someone says, here's an opportunity to go live in Tokyo. You know, if that's not in your vision, you say, you know, thank you for the opportunity, but my goal is to have the best biscuits in the Midwest, and Tokyo is not necessarily going to help me do that. So while I was working on the book, I wrote a vision, and I was actually reading it recently, and there were a couple of pieces of it that within 5 years, I took care of my godmother, my Aunt Maxine, and she passed away in January at 94. But just of old age, not of anything wrong with her. And one of the things I had in the vision was that I hoped I could take care of her so that her last years were happy and peaceful. And I feel like I accomplished that. I mean, I hope I did. And then I wrote that when I had made sure Maxine was taken care of, I wanted to live in New Orleans. So after she passed away in January, I decided this is my opportunity to move to New Orleans, and I moved to New Orleans. So I had been visiting there for years. I rode in Mardi Gras parades. I have many friends in the culinary world there. I'm a member of a group called Les Dames d'Escoffier. Julia Child started it. And I thought, you know what, I could stay in Ann Arbor and everything will kind of be the same, or I can just take the plunge and go to New Orleans for a year and see if I really like it. Now, I don't know if anyone has bought Michelle Obama's new book yet, but if you do buy it, there's a whole chapter in there on conquering fear so you can do things like move to New Orleans. And she gives an example of her husband telling her in 2007 that he wanted to run for president, but he wouldn't do it without her approval. And her first instinct was to say no. And she realized that it wasn't that she didn't want him to be president, it was that she was fearful about him running for president. And so conquering that fear allowed them to have an incredible 8 years in the White House. So for me, it was sort of like, well, New Orleans, you know, I can just go visit, blah, blah, blah. And I just decided, you know what, I want the experience of living there. And now I'm having the experience of living there. So I do give Zingerman some of the credit for that.
That's awesome. You mentioned New Orleans. There's a restaurant down there called Shio, right? So I think one of the interesting things that came out in the book is the connection between a lot of really famous restaurateurs and Zingerman's. I didn't ask how many people here are familiar with Zing Train. Anyone familiar with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Why don't you tell what Zing Train is and then talk about some of the connection with some of these famous restaurateurs.
So way back when, one of the things that Zingerman's wanted to do was to make sure that its employees were educated, trained, understood the values of the company so that there was a consistent treatment of customers. You know, everybody you talk to would have gone through different classes and would know the values and would understand what Zingerman's was about. And it's a sort of a three-legged stool: good food, good service, and good finances. They actually don't have a huge profit goal. They have about a 5% net income goal every year. And they have always felt that they needed to share information with their employees. And so as they were deciding to create this community of businesses, they thought one of the things we can be doing is training our employees, and they set up what's called Sing Train. But then they realized that the principles they were teaching their employees might be useful to other people. So one of the first people that hired them was Rick Bayless in Chicago. And he'd hired Zingerman's to teach customer service to his employees. And Rick's employees are far different from those in Ann Arbor because, as he likes to joke, Ari can hire all these people working on their PhDs. And in Chicago, probably 90% of Rick's employees are not born in the United States. So they don't necessarily have the educational background, but they have the drive and they have the interest in food, and he wanted to make sure that they got a consistent message. So if you look at the back of the book, I've got Danny Meyer, who I admire greatly in New York. I've got T. Martin, who is the owner of Commander's Palace in New Orleans. Dory Greenspan, the wonderful cookbook writer, and Patricia Wells, who's one of my mentors in the culinary world. And so all these people have been touched by Zingerman's in some way. Alon Shaya, so I don't know if people are familiar with him, but he has been a very celebrated chef in New Orleans, and he was part of the John Besh organization. And so the Besh organization financed his restaurant called Shaya. Then John Besh got in great trouble in the Me Too scandal, and essentially was driven out of his business empire because so many people came forward to talk about the harassment that they'd gotten. Alon went public talking about the situation in the restaurants, and so the Besh organization sued him, and the upshot was that he lost the rights to his own name, because when they financed him, the name Shia was would revert to the Besh organization if they ever broke up. So at the lowest point of his life, Alon goes to a conference in North Carolina and shares a 3-hour car ride with Ari. And basically it was like like a therapist session. And Alon basically unloaded, like, I've worked my whole career, it's probably 35 I worked all this time to have a name for myself, and I don't own my name anymore, and what am I gonna do now? And it wasn't that Ari told him what to do, it was that Ari kind of talked him through what was the most important thing to him, what were the values that he wanted to live by, what did he want his employees to express to customers and that sort of thing. And Alon is very vocal in giving Ari credit for not only kind of saving him psychologically, but saving his business career. Now he's got 2 restaurants in New Orleans, Saba, and then up in Denver, there's Safta, and he has Miss River in New Orleans, which is in the Four Seasons, and he will soon have a new restaurant in the Wynn Hotel in Las Vegas. So from the depths to a much better place, and he and his wife Emily now have a little girl who's about 17 months old. So I think that to me is like, I didn't think they'd ever have kids. I didn't think he would get off the push upward, and they do. And so he's a very devoted dad now, in addition to being a very successful restaurant person.
I know we're here to talk about Zingerman's. Is he originally from Israel? Is it?
He's from Philadelphia, but he's Israeli background.
Gotcha.
So it's like Michael Solomonov, kind of the same kind of background.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Questions? We have time? Okay. So I have one more question, and then we can open it up if there's any questions here. So I guess, educate a little bit about some of the experiences that individuals could have with Zingerman, some of their food tourism, things
sure,
along those
yeah,
lines,
yeah.
or cooking classes, etc.
Okay, so I'm sort of a great example of everything you can experience at Zingerman's, not just because of the book, but the things I was doing before the book. So since about the year 2000, I have taken dozens of the cooking classes at Zingerman's. I've taken espresso, butter, gelato, chocolate, mole, flatbreads. I took a pie class and I cried because I don't have, I shouldn't say I don't have, I keep remembering I have to say I have not mastered the technique of rolling pastry. I don't know why. I could do lots of other stuff. I just don't have that. I watch these food shows and I'm like, no. And I'm like, I have not mastered that technique. You can take an American cookie class. I took a class and we made whoopie pies, and that led to a story in the New York Times. I was looking for something that could become useful in another way. So you can take the classes. You can go to programs that they have at the deli every year. They have a program called Ari's Favorite Things, and they serve little samples of 30 different things that he's liked that year. They have food tours, which go lots of places, Morocco, Ireland. One of the guys that I know who was working at Zingerman's has been traveling Asia, and we think he's gonna come back and lead some food tours in Asia. There's coffee, there's the creamery, there's all the Zing Train classes, mail order. There's several restaurants. We've talked about the deli and we've talked about the Roadhouse, but there's also a restaurant called Miss Kim. Has anyone eaten at Miss Kim? So great. So Jihye Kim, Jahye, was an MBA student at Michigan in 2007. She read my article about Zingerman's and she decided she wanted to work there. I'm like, wow. And she started at the deli. She went to become a cook at the Roadhouse. She had an idea for a food truck called Sand Street. And from Sand Street, she pitched them on the idea of a restaurant called Miss Kim. And Miss Kim was recently, or Jihye was recently named one of the rising star chefs across the country, I think by Bon Appetit. And she's getting an enormous amount of visibility now. I think her food is very good. It's kind of gourmet-ish Korean food inspired by her upbringing. It's a nice little restaurant, and so when you're up there sometime, if it interests you,
That's
I would
in
check it
Carytown?
out. That's in Carytown, yeah.
All right, so we have time for some questions, if there's questions from the crowd. Michael?
Yeah, okay.
Or we'll repeat it.
Don't
too.
yell, we'll repeat it. It's not good for your throat.
Right.
Yeah.
How difficult is it to run Zingerman's empire in a college town?
Yeah.
You're having a lot of kids coming, graduating, they're young, do they really buy into the training, walk away? What do they do with that training afterwards?
Yeah, so Zingerman, a couple of things. First of all, basically everybody's parents come to Ann Arbor and take you to Zingerman's, even if you haven't gone there yourself. So, I mean, the alumni network is just incredible. But there's tons and tons of young people. Whenever I go to the deli, they have a big outdoor seating area. And, it's people like me, but it's also my nephews and it's their friends. And they never say no to eating at Zingerman's. What do people do with it? Well, there's a huge Zingerman's alumni network. If anyone's ever been to London and gone to Borough Market, there's a cheese store called Neal's Yard Dairy, and that was founded in England by graduates of Zingerman's, essentially. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of people across Ann Arbor that once worked at Zingerman's and have gone on to other businesses. There are folks in Chicago. There was a deli that's right by the Music Box Theater, and they said in their interviews, like in the Chicago Tribune, we're inspired by Zingerman's in Ann Arbor. So I think of it as kind of like this hub of a nucleus of a global food community, and it isn't just Ann Arbor, it's not just Southeast Michigan or the Midwest, it's pretty much in every part of the country, and the world. Yeah. Who else has a question? Don't be shy, go ahead.
Kind of a comment and a question, and has been a big fan of this debate over it all the time.
Yeah.
And then, get the catalogs and the flyers, actually in the notebooks, they'll have the flyers. And then if you remember on Seinfeld, It was just that idea of not thinking of it that way until that Seinfeld. that
Right, yeah,
catalog.
Peterman, yeah.
You just described things in the most over-the-top way, and you buy into it.
Well, that is.
So my question is, the writers.
Oh, the writing, okay, so the guys the gentleman, there's 3 managing partners at Mail Order, and they kind of divide up the work, and one of them is over the writers. And they are working on that copy pretty much so the Christmas is their big season. So they're gonna put maximum effort into making that Christmas catalog, or the holiday catalog, as appealing as possible. They say that there's 11 months of the year, and then there's the holidays. And so it's kind of like the Super Bowl for them. And it's very deliberate, and Ari, is a writer. And I don't know if anyone gets his newsletters or has ever read his books, but Ari loves to expound. And so it's a company that really values the written word. I've always thought, because there's no Zingerman's podcast, which I find very curious, that they don't do a whole lot of visual and audio. It's very much like the page and illustrations. And so I guess it works for them. I've always thought that they could do more if they wanted to with movies and sound. But I think the world that Ari and Paul live in is more of a old school written and illustrated world.
That leads to another question. Was it worth it?
Oh, yes, but then you have to rate yourself in. You just get caught up in it. I have to have that.
$100 bottle of balsamic vinegar.
And that's not the most expensive bottle. Yeah, so if you go, if you go to the deli, there's a locked case, and there's a $350 bottle of balsamic. And I'm kind of like, okay, I'm not gonna spend that. The one that's $30 is fine for me, which is still 30. My mother is up in heaven, like, you spent $30 on vinegar. But I think that if you appreciate it and you feel it's a good value, you can go to a bar and cocktails are $15 now, so you can get 2 drinks or you can get a bottle of balsamic vinegar. And what's gonna make you happier, right? So, yeah, sure.
Talking about the prices, they're on the high end of deli prices. How are they dealing with the food cost increases now? At some point,
Great question.
It's everybody in every type of restaurant is getting pounded. And I will say, I wrote an article that went to anyone who pre-ordered my book, and then it's since appeared in the Ann Arbor Observer on how to get a deal at Zingerman's, because you actually can get some deals at Zingerman's. How? Well, I'll give you a few. I don't want to, so the deli puts all the pastries on half price after 5 o'clock. So, because they close at 7, they used to be open later. But if you want a croissant, or you want an apricot Danish or a scone or something like that, and it's still there, they'll give you it for half off. They have day-old bread that's 35% off. If you go to the Roadhouse, there are blue plate specials for breakfast and lunch. If you are on the mail order list, every so often they have a sale. They have the oil change sale where they bring in the new grassy olive oil. They have a pasta sale. I'm trying to think if Creamery has any sales. Not as much, but so everybody in the food world is it's really hard for them. And so the traditional measurement was 30-30-30, that you want 30% food cost, 30% overhead, and 30% staffing, and then that would leave you 10% at the end. Zingerman's has basically said, if we net 5% at the end of a year, we're fine, because we want to have health care for our employees, we want to have training for our employees, we want they offer them shoes. I mean, I didn't know this until I wrote the book. I mean, they're eligible to buy equipment like shoes to wear on the floor, that kind of thing. They could make more money, and they know that. And I think if the accountants ever got in there, they would find lots of ways to make Zingerman's a more streamlined company. But would you be taking apart what makes it Zingerman's? And I think that's the big question.
So one of the other things, when you read the book, you reference it, during the pandemic, they were a little bit nervous about cash, like a lot of us business owners were. They did some fishing with private equity to kind of see, hey, what's our intellectual property worth?
So, I don't know if anyone's heard of Blue Bottle Coffee. Blue Bottle Coffee in San Francisco. Blue Bottle started with one coffee cart in the 2000s, and it was sold right before the pandemic for $792 million. And they've got coffee shops, and then Blue Bottle is marketed across the country. So I was told that, I mean, there are money people that told Paul when he went looking for help that we will loan you anything you want. We'll take a stake. We'll figure out a way to we could sell some kind of equities, that sort of thing. I am absolutely convinced this is $1 billion company. Now, the revenue isn't that high. It's 70 million. They're back to where they were before the pandemic. It's probably 75 in the next couple years, and I think they could hit 100 million in revenue someday, but they don't really have the production capacity at the moment to do that. But given what brand value is so much different than the value of the operations. So I think given 2 million names on a mailing list, the 40-year heritage, the network, that sort of thing, I think this is probably $1 billion enterprise.
So you don't have to feel bad if they're only making 5%. That's okay.
Yeah.
They may just have to wait. Any other, over here?
Hi, Margaret.
So is Paul Saginaw still focused on his businesses out in Las Vegas?
Yeah.
Or is he still involved with Zingerman?
Well, he's kind of winding it down. He's still officially the co-founder with Ari. Paul Saginaw owns a deli in Vegas called Saginaw's, and he opened it a couple of years ago. And if you go in there, there's a life-size statue of Paul Saginaw that you could take a selfie with. It's kind of like the big boy, only it's Paul Saginaw. He wants to have a third act. He started as a restaurant manager in Ann Arbor. He then co-founded Zingerman's. And I think he wanted to just prove that he could still play the game like Tom Brady. We can see how well that's going. He is involved, but they are taking steps to kind of wind him down. Because Zingerman's financial setup is so complicated, it's not as easy as just let's write Paul a check and he'll go off into the sunset. They have to take a few years and reimburse him for the value of all the licenses. So still involved, but I would say in the next couple of years, he'll probably be, waving. So, but Ari's there for the long haul, and they are talking about succession. They are trying to figure out a structure for succession. They're not in any hurry to do that. Yeah. There's one more question over here. Yes, hi.
Hi, I just want to take this opportunity to thank Hallie Freed and her staff from Colette and Sherry for this wonderful book festival this last
Oh,
week.
yay.
That seems like a really good place to end, doesn't it? All right, so Hallie, do you want to come up and finish us off here? Thank you. I'm excited for all of you who got this book. You're going to be signing?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So she's willing to sign. And Hallie?